Eridu sat unexcavated for 65 years. That is a hard sentence to place next to the rest of the record. Eridu is not an obscure village site, not a ruined fort with uncertain dating, not a mound of local interest inflated by internet mythology. It is Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, one of the oldest urban settlements ever excavated in Mesopotamia, the city the Sumerian king list places first when it says, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." It stands inside the landscape that later traditions, biblical and otherwise, kept circling whenever they tried to imagine a first place, a watered place, a place before ordinary history hardened around us. And yet the major excavation stopped in 1949, and the site, by the admission of later archaeologists, was not systematically investigated again for more than half a century. I kept returning to that interval, not because it proves anything by itself. It does not, but because it sits at the centre of a larger pattern I find difficult to dismiss. The one landscape most often proposed in serious scholarship for the memory behind Eden is also a landscape damaged by war, drained by politics, and in crucial respects documented first through imagery that began its life in military archives, literally classified long before archaeologists could treat it as ordinary evidence. If I sound cautious, that is deliberate. I am not interested in turning Genesis into a treasure map or in pretending that one excavation trench can settle an argument that has lasted for centuries. But I am also no longer satisfied with the standard shrug that places Eden somewhere in the realm of pure symbolism and leaves it there, untouched, untested, politely sealed off from the archaeology of southern Mesopotamia. The more closely I read, the less adequate that silence felt. There is data here, there are texts, stratigraphic levels, museum objects, survey maps, hydrological studies, and declassified aerial photographs. There are institutional names attached to all of it. There are dates. The question is not whether the record exists. The question is why so many people have preferred not to let the pieces touch. The mainstream foundation is stronger than most people realize. Genesis 2 does not describe an abstract heaven, but a garden watered by a river that divides into 4 heads. There's 2 of which are named plainly, the Tigris and the Euphrates. That detail has kept serious scholars anchored to Mesopotamia for generations. Eric Klein, writing in, noted that most recent scholars place Eden in or around ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere between the Persian Gulf and southern Turkey. Decades earlier, Ephraim A. Spicer of the University of Pennsylvania, one of the major biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholars of the 20th century, argued in the Rivers of Paradise that Eden belonged near the head of the Persian Gulf where the Tigris and Euphrates converged. This is not fringe material. It is standard scholarly territory, and it has been for a long time. Then there is the Mesopotamian side of the record. So the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature preserves the myth usually called Enki and Ninhursag, where Dilmun is praised as pure, virginal, and pristine. In that text, the lion does not kill, the wolf does not snatch the lamb, sickness is absent, age is absent, and the land becomes fully alive only when fresh water rises from underground and turns pools of salt water into pools of fresh water. That is a very specific paradise. It is not a cloud, it is not a vague moral state, it is an ecological condition. UNESCO's description of the Awa of southern Iraq makes the geographical point even sharper. Uruk, and Eridu, the great cultural components of the property, that were originally situated on the margins of freshwater marshes and rose with that unstable deltaic landscape before later drying, and salinization contributed to their decline. Archaeology deepens the same picture. Eridu has been in the scholarly record for a very long time. John George Taylor visited Tel Abu Shahrain in 1854 for the British authorities at Basra and came away unimpressed, thinking the mound had yielded little of importance. Reginald Campbell Thompson surveyed it in 1918. Harry R. H. Hall followed in 1919. Only after Iraqi independence did the site receive the kind of sustained excavation it required. Large-scale Iraqi work began in 1946 under Fuad Safar, assisted by Seton Lloyd. Beneath the later ziggurat they uncovered an extraordinary sequence, temple after temple, level after level, reaching back through the Uruk period into the Ubaid. The formal report describes the earliest recognizable shrine in level 17 as a small square chamber, only 2.80 meters across internally, sitting just above virgin sand, with a little central pedestal of sun-dried brick Around it, over centuries, the sacred architecture grew upward and outward until a full monumental cult centre stood over the accumulated memory of the earlier shrines. Penn Museum's own bulletin, describing the work during the war years, stressed that even the earliest Ubaid temple already displayed features that would define Mesopotamian religious architecture much later. The continuity is unmistakable, so is the seriousness of the scholarship. The difficulty is not absence of data, it is what we choose not to do with it. The anomaly enters quietly. So nothing in the mainstream record says, in a sensational way, this is Eden. That is precisely why I keep circling back. What the record does say is more interesting. It says the most plausible zone for the memory behind Eden lies in Lower Mesopotamia, or near the Persian Gulf. It says one of the oldest sacred cities in that zone is Eridu. It says Eridu was devoted to Enki, lord of subterranean fresh water and wisdom. It says the surrounding marsh world once mediated fresh and salt water, in a way later myth preserved with remarkable precision. It says the first city in the Sumerian king tradition stood there before the flood. And then, at the exact point where a serious investigator would expect the questions to intensify, the conversation tends to stop. Eden becomes literary, Eridu becomes archaeological. Dildman becomes comparative mythology. The files are separated, the disciplines retreat behind their doors. I want to stay with one fact for a moment. For more than 50 years, the site and area of Eridu were not systematically investigated. That sentence comes from Marco Ramazzotti's 2015 discussion of the renewed Iraqi-Italian mission. More than 50 years. If you measure from the end of the major 1948-49 season to the permit signed in August 2014, the interval is 65 years. One of the oldest cultic cities on Earth. 65 years. There are reasonable explanations for that. Iraq's 20th century did not offer easy continuity for field archaeology. The monarchy fell, the republic destabilized. The Iran-Iraq war ran from 1980 to 1988. Saddam Hussein's regime drained much of the southern marshland in the 1990s after the uprisings that followed the Gulf War. Sanctions hollowed out institutions. The 2003 invasion and its aftermath devastated museum systems, field logistics, and site protection across the country. Mudbrick architecture erodes fast even in calmer decades. All of that is true. I want to be fair about it. But even when I grant every one of those factors, I still do not think they close the question. Because the silence is not only about excavation, it is also about curiosity. The same scholarly world that can responsibly say Eden belongs somewhere in or near Mesopotamia has seemed strangely reluctant to ask whether southern Mesopotamian sacred geography preserved a cultural memory later rewritten in biblical form. That is not a reckless question, yet it is the next question. Start with the biblical text itself. Genesis 2:10 says, "A river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 headwaters. 2 names are clear, Hiddekel, the Tigris, and Parath, the Euphrates. The other 2, Pishon and Gihon, remain disputed, which has allowed many readers to dismiss the whole geography as theological decoration. I understand that move. I also think it is too quick. If a story is meant to float free of landscape entirely, why anchor it to 2 major rivers with such stubborn specificity? Why preserve that much geography at all? Then place beside it the Sumerian material. In Enki and Ninhursag, Dilmun is not merely blessed. It is hydrologically transformed. Fresh water runs out of the ground. Pools of salt water become pools of fresh water. Disease disappears. An age disappears. Predation disappears. This is not the language of a random paradise. It is the language of a threshold environment, the kind of place where underground fresh water, riverine flow, tidal intrusion, and marsh ecology decide whether land is habitable or sterile. Southern Iraq and the Gulf littoral are precisely that kind of place. Why does the older paradise tradition revolve around exactly that problem? Now return to Eridu. The excavators found the earliest shrine almost directly above virgin sand, then a succession of superimposed temples beneath the later platform and ziggurat. The city's patron god was Enki, associated with the subterranean sweet waters of the Apsu. In Sumerian memory, Eridu is first, antediluvian, and foundational. In archaeological fact, it sits at the edge of the marsh world UNESCO describes as central to the rise of southern Mesopotamian civilization. The biblical Eden is a watered origin zone. Eridu is an origin city of fresh water cult. How far apart are those categories really? Before moving forward, this deserves attention. In the British Museum, in room 56, there is a small Ubaid period figurine with the registration number 1930-1213-173. It is fired clay, only 13.8 centimeters high and 4.9 centimeters wide. The adult figure is female, though her head is gone. The neck ends in a break that the museum notes may have been deliberate in antiquity. Her lower body narrows into a conical base so she can stand upright. Black paint still marks a collar tied down the back, dotted and striped bands across the shoulders, the nipples, wristbands, and a girdle. On her left hip she supports a child. The child's head is described by the museum, carefully and without embellishment, as reptilian-like. Its own eyes, collar and girdle are painted black. Leonard Woolley's team found the figurine at loose in soil in a shaft descending from a plano-convex brick level toward what the old field notation called an antediluvian tomb level. According to the curator's note, it is the only semi-complete painted female figure of its kind found at and the only black-painted figurine from a grave. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. Stand in front of it and ask the obvious question, what was this for? I do not bring that object in to imply anything extravagant. I bring it in because it belongs to the same broad southern Mesopotamian world from which Eridu emerged. And because it reminds us that the emotional distance between academic catalogue language and actual visual experience can be enormous. A headless painted mother holding a reptilian-faced infant is real. It exists. It sits under museum glass. It comes out of the pre-Sumerian horizon adjacent to the very landscape later linked, again and again, to beginnings. How much of that world do we really understand? And then there is the matter of classification in the literal sense. For a long time, some of the most valuable images of Near Eastern landscapes were not archaeological archives at all, but intelligence archives. The U-2 reconnaissance flights of the late 1950s and 1960s and the Corona satellite program produced imagery later described by archaeologists as earlier and in some respects better than what standard field surveys had. That Emily Hammer and Jason noted that U-2 photographs can reveal standing architecture, canal traces, even the spatial history of marsh Arab settlement before later destruction. Those images began as Cold War military intelligence. They were declassified years later and only then became tools for archaeology. I want to sit with that before moving on. The landscape most often associated with the memory of Eden was, in crucial visual fragments, preserved first by surveillance systems built for war. What exactly have we been treating as peripheral? If this were only about Eridu, I would be more cautious than I already am, but the pattern broadens in ways I find hard to ignore. Across cultures with no documented contact, one structure keeps appearing, a first place or divine enclosure set apart from ordinary terrain, a tree, fruit, and/or plant conferring vitality or immortality, a guarded boundary, a rupture after which access is lost. The details vary, the logic does not. Take central Mexico. In Nahua tradition, Tamaoanchan is remembered as a primordial place of origin, abundance, and rupture. In the codices, its place glyph is not abstract. It is a tree, split or cleft, flowering and often shown as bleeding. Scholars have long pointed to Codex Lord and Codex Vaticanus B for versions of that image, and to the 8-year Atamalcualistli ceremony associated with the Xochiquetzal and the Tree of Tamaoanchan. This is not just a nice paradise somewhere. It is a first place defined by a sacred tree and a break. A world once open becomes closed. The form is familiar. Move north to medieval Icelandic preservation of older Norse myth. In Snorri Sturluson's Gylfaginning, Aridun keeps the apples which the gods must taste whenever they grow old, and then they all become young. That is not metaphorical decoration at the edge of the story. It is a structural necessity. Without the guarded, life-giving fruit, time resumes its claim and the gods begin to age. Once Idun is removed, the order fails, the boundary is breached, the preserving substance is lost, and mortality floods back in. It is the same grammar in another language. Then go east to ancient China. The Queen Mother of the West, Shi Wangmu, rules a Western paradise associated with Kunlun, and by the Han period her orchard of peaches of immortality had become one of the central images of transcendent life. The Eastern Han relief, often titled Journey of the Soul to the Paradise of the Queen Mother of the West, is explicit about the destination. Ascent, its guarded arrival, the realm of the immortality goddess, the place where death no longer governs in the ordinary way. Later art makes the orchard lush and decorative, but the older structure is already set. A distant, elevated, bounded place. A life-giving food, restricted access. The same arrangement appears again. And there is a fourth example I do not think can be waved away as coincidence. In Maya tradition, the ordered world is raised around a central world tree, and there are 4 directional trees that hold the sky. The Popol Vuh preserves the cosmological frame in literary form, but the point becomes visual at Palenque and in later Maya iconography, where the Ciber-like axis stands at the center of creation and royal ritual, reenacts access to that first ordered place. This is not Eden in disguise, it is again. At the same structure, origin located, life organized around a sacred vegetal center, access mediated by the ritual and authority, the living world understood as something once established in a bounded and charged place rather than nowhere at all. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? Why do cultures separated by oceans and centuries keep preserving the same architecture of memory? First place, sacred tree or fruit? Boundary loss? I'm not saying the stories are identical, they are not. I am saying they solve the same human problem with the same narrative machinery, often attached to concrete things you can point to, quote, or place in a museum case. As I discussed before in a previous piece on flood traditions, that the oldest stories are often less interested in chronology than in terrain. They remember where water stood, where silt gathered, where survival depended on a narrow ecological balance. That matters here. Southern Mesopotamia is not just symbol-rich, it is physically strange. It is a place where fresh water and salt water negotiate constantly, where marsh becomes field and field becomes marsh, where a city can look inland now and still have been tied to a literal world in deep antiquity. Geoffrey Rose's Persian Gulf Oasis hypothesis pushes the same point farther south. Before flooding around 8,000 years ago, the exposed Gulf Basin may have formed a refuge watered by the Tigris, Euphrates, Curran, Wadi Batin, and underground springs. Rose noted that, after the inundation, more than 60 new archaeological sites appeared along the Gulf shore virtually overnight, as if displaced populations had emerged from a drowned heartland already carrying developed lifeways. That does not prove Eden. It does make the older Mesopotamian and biblical focus on that zone feel less arbitrary. Before moving further, I want to slow down again. UNESCO states plainly that the remains of Uruk, Ur and Eridu, now in desert, were originally near freshwater marshes that later receded, became saline, and dried. That is not a metaphor. That is an official description of the environmental history of the exact cities most central to early southern Mesopotamia. When later texts remember a watered beginning in that region, they are not inventing wetness out of nothing. They are writing over a real and unstable hydrological past. And so why has this not been pursued with more seriousness? Some of the reasons are legitimate and should be stated first. Southern Iraq has suffered repeated interruption on a scale difficult for stable academic systems to absorb. War shuts roads, empties budgets, militarizes zones, and redirects state attention. Sanctions keep equipment out, bureaucracies age, foreign teams lose permits. Local scholars are overburdened by the conservation crises. UNESCO's own assessment warned that the authenticity and integrity of the southern Iraqi sites are highly vulnerable, and that no major restoration or conservation projects had been carried out since the 1930s, except for limited work on the Ur-Ziggurat in the 1960s. Those are not excuses, they are realities, and the ecology itself keeps punishing delay. The mud brick in southern Iraq is not romantically durable. Once exposed, it slumps, powders, salts, and peels under rain, wind, and extreme temperature shifts. The same UNESCO materials that celebrate the Ahwa also warn of urgent erosion and collapse in the archaeological fabric. Even the marshes, so often invoked as if they were timeless, are not stable backdrops. USGS Landsat sequences show the Mesopotamian marshes near maximum extent in 1972, then diminishing, drying, and only partially recovering after the catastrophic drainage campaigns of the 1990s and early 2000s. Every decade of delay changes not just what archaeologists can excavate, but what they can still contextualize. A tell without its water history is already half explained, but they are not enough. The publication history alone should unsettle us. The major Iraqi excavations at Eridu ran from 1946 to 1949. The full report did not appear until 1981, 32 years. Then came the longer silence. 65 years from the end of the major campaign to the 2014 permit for renewed excavation. 65 years. That is not just instability. That is a civilizational blind spot. And notice what happened when institutional motion finally resumed. The 2014 permit for the Iraqi-Italian mission was real. UNESCO inscription of the Ahwar in 2016 was real. Later state of conservation documents welcomed the return of international teams to Uruk, and Eridu, and stressed management plans, monitoring, staffing, and conservation. All of that matters. I do not want to understate it. But conservation language is not the same thing as an integrated historical question. A site can be fenced, listed, and stabilized and still remain conceptually abandoned. That to me is the deeper problem. Eridu has been protected more seriously than it has been thought with. The paperwork returned faster than the curiosity. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. Eridu sits in the crack between disciplines. Biblical scholars can mention Mesopotamia without mastering the excavation history of Eridu. Assyriologists can work the temple sequence without wanting to touch Eden, because Eden attracts bad scholarship and public noise. Landscape archaeologists can map paleochannels and marsh recession without taking theological memory seriously. Historians of religion can compare myths without walking the tell. Each restraint is understandable in isolation. That together they create a system in which the most obvious integrative question is almost guaranteed not to be asked. The classified imagery adds one more layer to that failure, and I think it matters symbolically as much as methodologically. No one hid U2 film in order to conceal Eden. That would be absurd. The photographs were taken to watch enemies, not origins, but once declassified, they showed archaeologists canal systems, settlement patterns, and marsh lifeways that had already been damaged or erased. In other words, part of the best visual archive for this foundational landscape spent decades in a military intelligence pipeline while the public conversation about Eden drifted between literalism and ridicule. That is not conspiracy, it is a portrait of how modern institutions fail to assemble meaning. Which I have covered in a previous piece on declassified aerial archaeology. The archive is often most revealing not for what it says outright, but for what it makes newly visible after the fact. By the time a photograph becomes usable, the world it captured may already be gone. That is painfully true in the Iraqi marshes. Landsat and later surveys document shrinking, drainage, and partial recovery. Field archaeology arrives to mud brick already eroding. Oral landscapes are displaced. The site remains, but the setting that once explained it grows harder to recover each year. So let me state carefully what I'm not claiming. I am not saying Genesis is a stenographic report from the 6th millennium BC. I am not claiming Eridu has been proven to be the Garden of Eden. I am not saying the British Museum figurine, or any other artefact, carries a hidden confession about lost prehistory. What I am saying is narrower and to me harder to dismiss. Mainstream scholarship places the remembered geography behind Eden somewhere in or near Mesopotamia. Mainstream Sumerian texts describe a nearby paradise whose defining feature is the arrival of fresh water into a salt world. Mainstream archaeology identifies Eridu as the earliest sacred city in southern Mesopotamia, devoted to the god of the subterranean sweet waters, built on the edge of the marsh landscape UNESCO says once shaped the rise of those cities. Mainstream publication history confirms that this site then endured a 65-year gap in systematic investigation. The mainstream remote sensing scholarship confirms that some of the best early visual records of this wider landscape sat inside declassified intelligence imagery before archaeologists could fully use them. None of that is speculative. The implication may be debatable, the record is not. And once I accept that, the unanswered questions come quickly. Why preserve the Tigris and Euphrates by name if the garden had no recoverable geography behind it? What memory is being carried when Dilmun's salt pools become fresh and Genesis places a first garden where rivers divide? The record does not tell us why the earliest shrine at Eridu rises almost directly above virgin sand in a landscape later remembered as primordial, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Well, why did the full Eridu excavation report take 32 years to appear, and a new permit 65, museum number 1930, 1213, 173, Why was that painted mother with the reptilian-faced child placed in a grave, and why may its head have been broken deliberately? A paradise remembered by hydrology? What lay in the Gulf Basin before those more than 60 shoreline sites appeared so suddenly around 7,500 years ago? What did the U-2 frames see over southern Iraq in 1960 that field archaeologists would not be positioned to ask about for decades? The records tell us that marsh, city, shrine and origin story all converge in the same region, and I find the lack of a sustained cross-disciplinary answer harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Well, why has the conversation so often ended exactly where the disciplines would should have begun speaking to one another? We still do not know where memory ended and place began. In room 56 of the British Museum, the little clay body still stands. The light is museum light, soft and controlled, flattening nothing, forgiving nothing. The adult figure's head is gone, so the eye is pulled instead to the painted bands that remain on the neck's stump, shoulders, wrists and waist, and then to the child pressed against the left hip, its small face narrowed into that unsettling shape the catalogue calls reptilian-like. The cone base keeps the figure upright with a kind of stubborn dignity. She has been broken, buried, excavated, divided in the old partage system, catalogued, conserved and placed behind glass. Outside that case, empires ended. Marshes were drained, wars passed over southern Iraq, satellites watched from above, and Eridu waited in the dust. I try not to force meaning onto that object. It resists it anyway. It belongs to a world older than Sumerian kingship as later texts remembered it, older than the biblical redaction of Eden, older than almost every institutional language we now use to sort myth from archaeology. But it exists in the same subtropical Mesopotamian horizon, and once you have seen it, it becomes harder to pretend that the earliest layers of this region are intellectually tame. The object is too intimate for that, too physical, too local. It makes the distance between catalogue language and lived meaning feel suddenly very small. You can read the label in 10 seconds, yet you can spend 10 minutes with the figure and still leave unsure whether you have looked at an offering, a warning, a goddess, or a fragment of family grief. Whatever people in that world feared, honoured, nursed, buried, or hoped to protect, they gave it form. And not far away, at Enkidu beneath the later ziggurat, the first little shrine once stood above virgin sand, as if sacred architecture itself had decided to begin there and keep beginning there, one rebuilding after another, over and over, until the memory of the starting point was almost completely buried by the weight of continuity. I cannot prove that this is the landscape behind Eden. I do not know any honest person who can, but I also cannot accept that the overlap between text, hydrology, cult, geography and neglect is trivial, it is too consistent. And it has been sitting in the excavation reports, museum cases, UNESCO documents and declassified imagery for decades, waiting for someone to risk asking a very old question without embarrassment. The longer I look at Eridu, the harder it becomes to tell whether archaeology uncovered a ruin there or a memory called Eden.